Hello everyone, this is Ao3 podfic, back with another podfic. Today I will be reading Chapter 2 of Again I Burn, Can You Reach Out by Captain_Autumn on Ao3. Some trigger warnings for this will be an almost panic attack and a lot of self-hate from Leo, because that boy needs therapy. Alright, let's get right into it. It was now 2 days after the fight with the Stymphalian birds, and Leo had actually been doing pretty well. Sure, his interaction with Coach Hedge in the infirmary had shaken him a bit. He was unused to having people outright express that they cared about him, but if he was being honest with himself, he liked it. A lot. The actual patching up of his wound had hurt like a bitch, of course, and the bandages made moving his torso feel a little strange, but overall the wound had hurt a lot less than before it had been tended to. His sleep that night had been amazing, for the first time in a while. After dinner, which he did get to on time, he had practically been falling asleep where he was sitting, and it had only taken a little bit of pushing from Coach Hedge for him to let the satyr guide Leo back to his room, to sleep in his own bed for once. He had fallen asleep pretty much as soon as his head hit the pillow, and he had stayed asleep the whole night, and well into the morning, with no nightmares he could remember once he woke up. Admittedly, it was kind of strange feeling to be well rested, and even though it was nice to be able to keep his thoughts slightly more on track than usual, he knew it wasn't something that would happen again anytime soon. It had only happened because he was bone tired, exhausted both mentally and physically, and even with the ridiculously dangerous quest they were on, that sort of exhaustion didn't come easily or often to Leo. That had been made very obvious last night, when it took hours for Leo to fall asleep, and even then he barely got any from constantly being woke up from nightmares. Thankfully, the fact that he usually slept in the engine room meant that if he couldn't sleep, he could spend his time tinkering without risking waking anyone up or bumping into anyone if he tried to sneak from his room into the engine room in the middle of the night. That also meant that by midday, Leo had already been awake for about 8 hours and was running on about 4 hours of sleep at best. Normally he would be fine like this. Fine, in the sense that he had plenty of experience of running on next to no sleep, but today was different. A small ache had developed behind his eyes something mid-morning, which had then slowly but surely grown into a full headache as the day went on, getting worse and worse as the hours ticked by. The constant pain added to the lack of sleep made him grouchy, so he isolated himself in the engine room for the day in an attempt to decrease his interactions with the rest of the crew so he didn't accidentally snap at them. Luck wasn't on his side today, though, and things hadn't gone to plan. Annabeth knocked on the door to the engine room, snapping Leo's brain out of the fog it had fallen into and back into his body. The first thing he processed was the contraption he had half finished in his hands, puzzling it over for a second because he had no idea what it was and had been building it completely subconsciously while his mind wandered. But then he remembered Annabeth was there, so he turned his attention to her. "Hey, Annabeth," he said. "What's up?" Leo was secretly hoping that whatever she needed was short, because the second his mind was brought back into his body, he was reminded of the headache still plaguing him. But when she pulled out one of the stools from behind a desk, sitting down on it, he knew it probably wasn't going to be as short as he would like. Leo himself was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back propped up against the wall. Annabeth smiled at him, and he tried his best to return it, though he was afraid it came out more like a grimace. "I'd been meaning to come talk to you after the fight I'd been meaning to come talk to you after the fight with the Stymphalian birds the other day, but I got really busy and couldn't find the time to. But I finally managed to squeeze a break in so we can chat," she explained. "It was amazing, quick thinking, but I'm pretty sure even you couldn't have set up an entire sound system in that amount of time, so I guess I was really curious about how you did it." Leo shrugged, eyes already drifting down from Annabeth to focus on his creation, and started to fidget with it. Gods, he really hoped this conversation would be over quickly. "I already installed most of the system. I just needed to add the finishing touches," he half mumbled. Normally he would be ecstatic to talk about one of his inventions, especially with Annabeth. The two of them got along really well, actually, having a basic understanding of the other's interests from understanding of their own, and quite often bouncing ideas and conversations off each other animatedly. But right now, Leo felt like his brain was trying to expand and burst out of his head, which made it very hard to be energetic about anything. His usual personality be damned. Annabeth, unfortunately, didn't seem to pick up on his mood, and got comfortable on her chair in a way that Leo knew meant she intended to spend quite a while there. "That's what I suspected," she said with a nod, "but it's still very impressive." The praise made a soft, warm feeling bubble up in Leo's chest, enough to make Leo focus away from the pain in his head, at least for a second. It didn't last, though. As Annabeth kept talking, Leo loved the conversations he had with Annabeth, and he tried to focus as much as he could. He really did, making noises now and then to at least try and signal that he was listening, even if most of the words were going in one ear and out the other. And that, along with his headache, meant that he couldn't really formulate proper responses. His eyes dazedly followed his hands as they moved across the contraption in his lap, not processing what he was doing, as all his available brain cells went to trying to follow Annabeth's words as best he could, and to keep the irritation building from his exhaustion and pain down. From what little Leo caught of what she was saying, Annabeth was telling the story of how she and Percy dealt with the Stephallian birds the first time, something to do with a food-chasing ghost, a chariot race, and Chiron's records. It soured his mood further to realize that she was telling a story that he actually wanted to listen to. Frustration at himself adding itself to the mix and making Leo unsure of whether he wanted to scream or cry. Absent-mindedly, he lifted a hand up, rubbing it over his face before pressing it against one of his eyes and letting out a deep sigh. Annabeth did notice, as she suddenly stopped her story. "Leo, you okay?" she asked, worry evident in her voice, but suddenly being addressed while he was barely focusing made Leo jump. He looked up, meeting Annabeth's eyes only long enough to see her eyebrows furrowing in concern, and a frown forming. Before he looked back down again, he didn't have it in him to even look at anyone's face right now, let alone make eye contact. Leo sighed again, almost like he was trying to get rid of the frustration and pain by blowing it out through his breath. "I'm fine," he assured, though it was half muffled from his hand still over his face, and very clearly far more subdued than normal. "Are you sure?" Annabeth pressed. She kept talking, suddenly noticing Leo's unusual quietness and lack of energy, inquiring over and over about how he was feeling despite his continuous attempted reassurances and efforts to brush her concerns off. Try as he might, the added volume and the unwanted attention that almost felt invasive made the control he was attempting to keep on his emotions snap. Throughout the entire interaction, Leo had been mentally wobbling along a tightrope, anger on one side and misery on the other, and now he lost his balance and toppled quickly into anger. "Annabeth, I said I'm fine. Leave me alone." Silence. For a second, Leo was relieved. An edge was taken off of his headache, just enough for him to breathe properly again without feeling like each inhale sent a knife stabbing into his head. However, that brief relief also brought along a realization of what just happened. His head snapped up to look at Annabeth, an apology already on his lips when he saw the hurt in her eyes. "Annabeth, he began, but cut himself off as the hurt turned into anger. She stood up abruptly, knocking the stool over with a loud thunk. Leo couldn't help the way he flinched at the noise, or how he instinctively curled around his entrapment and pressed back into the wall in an attempt to make himself smaller. "You didn't have to be so rude about it," she glared down at him, and despite his brain knowing he couldn't get any smaller, he still tried to curl up even more. "But I can take a hint, too, when I'm not wanted." Leo didn't really register anything after that, not her storming out or her slamming the door behind her, although the loud noise did make him flinch again. All his anger melted away into pure despair, and the tears bubbled up before he could stop them. He curled up even further, if that was even possible, ducking his head down and pressing his eyes against his knees. He still had his creation in his lap, after all, and even when in the middle of a breakdown, he subconsciously knew that getting tears on it would be a bad idea. Leo was sobbing, he realized distantly. Silently, of course. He had learned to cry silently years ago in his first foster home, or else bad things would happen. Now it was just a habit, but each sob felt like hot iron pressing against his skull. His breaths were also coming shallow and short between sobs, his chest tight and adding to the pain. Leo could barely think beyond the pain, but that didn't stop him from berating himself. Why in Hephaestus' name had he done that? He knew better. He had better control over his emotions than that. He shouldn't have lashed out at Annabeth, no matter how tired he was or how much pain he was in. He ruined something else again. Distantly, it seemed almost funny to him that a son of Hephaestus, an inventor and a creator, was so good at ruining and destroying things. But then again, that was what fire did. It burned. It ruined. It destroyed. It really was fitting for Leo. He'd have to try and find a way to apologize properly to Annabeth later. He might try and explain the situation, but that would probably be more of an excuse than an explanation, which she also knew from experience would just make the situation worse. Would often end up with his hurt and his punishment more severe. So no, he wouldn't make excuses. He would just apologize profusely when he had pulled himself out of this pity party of his, and do whatever he could to make it up to Annabeth. It's what he needed to do to be a good friend. That was another lesson he had been taught at a foster home, so he assured himself it had to be right. But for now, all Leo could do was sob. One thing Gleeson certainly wasn't expecting when he was getting a drink of water from the common space was for one Annabeth Chase to come storming in and throw herself down on the couch next to Percy with an angry huff, her arms crossed. Percy, being the caring boyfriend he was, Gleeson begrudgingly had to acknowledge it, though he would probably have more of a problem with the couple if Percy wasn't possibly the best example of a partner Gleeson had ever seen, immediately focused all his attention on her. "Hey, wise girl, what's up?" he asked, wrapping a comforting arm around her. Annabeth sunk into the contact, losing most of her tension but still clearly angry. "I finally got time to go and talk to Leo about the fight the other day. It seemed like it was going well at first, but for pretty much the entire conversation, I was the only one saying anything. He was just fiddling with his random thing and barely responding, which I didn't even notice at the time, to be fair, because it was so exciting to talk about it with him. Eventually, I noticed that he was a little off beyond being just weirdly quiet, like he was super grumpy for no reason, and so I decided to check in on him, see if he was all right, but he kept dismissing me. But though I'm not an idiot, I could tell that something was wrong, and then he just blew up at me and got super angry and yelled at me to leave him alone. He was just so needlessly rude about it, and it was so infuriating," she ranted. When she was done, she let out a sigh along with the rest of her anger, slumping completely into Percy's hug. Percy frowned. "That sucks, yeah. Can't believe Leo would do something so mean like that," he said. "I have an idea. How about you and I have a chat with Jason and Piper later and see if they can get him to apologize? They know him pretty well, and so I'm sure they'll be able to stop this crazy anger or whatever and get him to see that he was a dickhead." "Thanks, Seaweed Ed." Annabeth smiled up at Percy and leaned up to give him a kiss on the cheek. "As much as I hate to admit it, sometimes you do have pretty decent ideas." The two fell into playful bickering, but Gleeson was on edge. Nothing about the conversation he just heard seemed right. He certainly wasn't trying to say that Annabeth was lying. He knew she would never lie about something like this, but he doubted she knew the whole situation. She was just going off her side, which was fairly valid, but Gleeson all but knew she didn't have the full story. He knew Leo would never act like that without a reason. The lack of energy, the discomfort, the snapping, it all painted a picture of Leo already struggling and then being backed into a corner trying to escape the only way he knew how. Admittedly, Gleeson knew that neither Annabeth or certainly not Percy had spent enough time with Leo to know this, but he'd also thought that the two of them had gone through enough on their own and had spent enough time around Leo to at least suspect that something may be up, given how Annabeth had described Leo's odd actions. He had certainly expected a far different response from Percy. Annabeth, he understood, even if he didn't like it, she had gotten caught up in an argument, gotten mad and left, and hadn't had time to calm down to be thinking things through rationally like she normally did. But Percy was completely calm, and even if he held Annabeth in a high regard as his girlfriend, Gleeson was disappointed in the way that he immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was Leo's fault, and the suggestion to drag Piper and Jason into this to force Leo to apologize, it was infuriating. Anyone who thought about it for more than 2 seconds would see that it was a terrible idea. However, Gleeson also knew that this wasn't anyone's fault. He'd plenty of experience dealing with situations like these, thanks to being a protector. Kids, teenagers especially, did dumb things, and being a demigod honestly just made it worse most of the time. Realistically, he knew that Leo probably just acted out in defense. Annabeth got angry and left without hearing Leo's side of things, and Percy just wanted to make sure Annabeth was okay and happy. But he still had to stop himself from glaring at the two teenagers sitting on the couch as his downed the rest of his glass and left. He needed to find Leo. Annabeth hadn't said where Leo was, so the satyr would have to figure it out on his own. There were 3 places Gleeson could think of that Leo would be: on the deck, at the control panel, in the engine room, or in his room. His room was both the least likely and the closest, so he checked there first. As he expected, there was no sign of Leo. It was just as cluttered with junk as usual, and the bed didn't look like it had been slept in recently. The fact that Leo slept on a thrown-together makeshift bed in the engine room most nights instead of his own room had always worried Gleeson, but he couldn't force the kid to do anything he didn't want to, and the demigod had even admitted once that he actually found it reassuring and easier to sleep there, surrounded by machinery and heat that he never did in his room. The deck was next. It was pretty clear, and he wasn't there when Frank and Hazel were having a conversation, leaning against the rail of the ship and looking completely normal. Gleeson knew they had been there for a while, as he now remembered that the two of them had gone up almost an hour ago. If Leo and Annabeth had had an argument at the control panel, which was well within earshot, the two of them would not look nearly so relaxed, so Gleeson just left to check the last place. Sure enough, when he opened the door to the engine room, Gleeson immediately spotted Leo's familiar head of dark curls. The next thing he noticed was how Leo was curled up in a ball and pressed up against the wall of the ship, as if he were waiting for a blow. Gleeson hurried over and knelt beside him, but he realized belatedly that it was a bad idea, as Leo flinched away from the loud noise and sudden movement. Gleeson cursed under his breath before he took a second to calm down. If he wanted to help Leo, he needed to be calm, not to be rash and make it worse. Leo was silently sobbing, and he was close to hyperventilating between sobs. Gleeson's heart hurt seeing the kid so distressed. He'd known he would need to have a word with Annabeth and Percy later to sort the situation out before they tried to drag Piper or anyone else into this before, but this was really cementing it. "Valdez?" he called quietly, trying to get Leo's attention. "Valdez, it's me, Coach Hedge. Can you hear me?" Leo let out a tiny whine, barely audible, and gave a tiny nod. Gleeson let out a sigh of relief. "Okay, good. Now I need you to calm down a bit. You're breathing too quickly." Leo just shook his head and sobbed again. Gleeson cursed himself mentally. He just made it seem like he was blaming the kid. "Can I touch you?" he asked after a pause. The curly-haired demigod next to him tensed up and barely but horrifyingly noticeable to Gleeson. "I'm not going to hurt you," he promised, keeping his voice quiet. "I'm just going to touch your shoulder, give you something to ground yourself." There was no response for a second, and Gleeson was just starting to panic that he had somehow made it worse without meaning to, when Leo gave a tiny, barely noticeable nod. Some of the tension and worry that Gleeson had felt building up in the silence dissipated. Gently, and as slowly as he could, he lowered his hand onto the boy's shoulder. Almost immediately, Leo's body sagged, and his next sob was clearly audible, and just as heartbreaking. Gleeson rubbed his hand over Leo's shoulder gently. As Leo sobbed, his heart breaking with each one, Leo slowly untucked himself from his ball, first leaning further into Gleeson's touch and eventually just sagging entirely into his side. He caught Leo and held him up easily, quickly moving to a more comfortable position for the both of them. Leo ended up in Gleeson's lap. The metal contraption that he had had in his lap that Gleeson had only seen once he uncurled now sat to the side. Leo was curled up again, less so than before, his head pressed against Gleeson's shoulder with Gleeson's arm around his back and supporting him, his hand still rubbing against his shoulder comfortingly. Gleeson's shirt was slowly becoming wet from the tears, but he didn't care in the slightest. All he cared about was whispering reassurances to the kid in his lap and running him through breathing exercises where he could calm him down. It took a while, but eventually Leo's sobs started to slow down, his breaths becoming deeper and longer. At some point, while comforting the demigod in his lap, Gleeson had begun to rock from side to side, as if he were rocking a baby to sleep, and he only realized as he stopped. Leo let out one last sob, and Gleeson quietly hushed him, his arm around the boy's back, tightening and squeezing him slightly without him even meaning to. But it clearly helped a lot, as any tension disappeared entirely, and he relaxed entirely into Gleeson's hold. For a second, Gleeson even managed to forget that the demigod he had had in his lap was a teenager, and he had looked down, fully expecting to see a young child, before he blinked in mild surprise when he realized where his brain had instinctively gone. Screw those fatherly instincts Melly had been teasing him about. Although Gleeson knew that he'd eventually have to get Leo to talk so he could help him with what was going on right now, he could leave dealing with the stuff about Annabeth until later. He didn't want to disturb Leo right now. The child of Hephaestus wasn't asleep, but he was certainly not fully awake either, somewhere between dazed and dozing. His brain would need a second to calm down and process things a little before Gleeson tried to push him towards talking about or even thinking about anything serious, so he decided just to let the kid rest for a little bit longer. Plus, you'd never catch him admitting it ever, but he liked being able to hold Leo in his lap. The satyr had definitely gotten far too attached to the kid, and he could see that at this point. But right now, he really felt like he was looking after his own son rather than a demigod in his care. Gleeson wasn't much of a physically affectionate person, but it was really important to him to be able to hold those he held dear. He'd always suspected it came with being a protector, and all the times he'd had to watch others lose their own loved ones, whether it be mortal families or demigod half-siblings. Gleeson wasn't sure exactly how long they'd stayed like that, but if he had to guess, he'd say around 10 or 15 minutes. He decided that he had let Leo rest for long enough. He could rest more later, but now they needed to figure out some things. Gleeson patted Leo's arm with his other hand. That wasn't Curly holding him up. "Valdez," he called out quietly. He needed the kid's attention. Yes, but loud noises never helped panic demigods, and certainly not ones that just had a breakdown. It was why he kept his voice barely louder than a whisper through this entire situation. Leo let out a whine, his eyes hooded and almost half asleep. "Valdez, I need you to sit up for me," Gleeson said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could so Leo didn't think that he was blaming him again. "I know you're tired right now and just want to sleep, but I need to know what happened so I can help you." Leo tensed again minutely, but relaxed immediately when Gleeson tightened his hold, or really it was more of a hug at this point, on the boy. It took a minute more of quiet coaxing, but eventually Leo did sit up slightly, or at least lifted his head off Gleeson's shoulder. He didn't move to get out of Gleeson's lap, though, and the satyr was more than happy to keep the kid safe in his arms, for as long as Leo was comfortable with it, even if Leo didn't know the reason Gleeson was so fine with holding him in his lap. "Hey, kid," Gleeson murmured when Leo finally lifted his head up, rubbing a hand tiredly over one eye, and Gleeson had to fight down the urge to coo at the fact that it made him look even more like a child. It was incredibly hard, though, when Leo flashed a small, tired smile up at him. "I know that you and Chase got into a fight," he started off with, and saw immediately when Leo's wall slammed up and locked into place. "Hey now, I'm not blaming you. I only overheard Chase talking to Jackson about it. She didn't try and tattle on you to me," he reassured. "I'm not blaming her either, to be fair. I just want to know what happened." Leo let out a sigh of relief, his walls falling back down. He started, but his voice was hoarse and he was cut off by a coughing fit. It was harsh, and Gleeson ended up patting his back as it kept going. "Whoa, hey, Valdez, breathe." "Sorry," Leo mumbled when his coughing stopped. "My throat was already kind of dry before everything, and now it made it worse. Now it's worse." "You're all good, kid." Leo began fidgeting with his hands resting in his lap, rubbing over his skin and picking at the fabric of his shorts. His eyes went there too, clearly not wanting to try and keep eye contact right now, which Gleeson understood. What did Annabeth say?" Leo's voice was thick with nerves. Gleeson sighed. "She said that she'd tried to come have a conversation with you, but you had been weirdly quiet, and when she asked you what was wrong, you got angry and yelled at her," he explained, intentionally cutting down the detail for both time and Leo's sake. "I'm not an idiot, though, and I know you're not the type to do something like that without a reason. I just don't think she has the full story yet, so I want to be able to hear what happened from you as well before I make any opinions or decisions." Leo winced. He trailed off, but Gleeson just remained silent. He'd let Leo take as long as he needed to find the right words. I, I didn't really get the best sleep last night," the demigod eventually began. "So I guess I was already kind of grumpy from being tired, but then I had gotten a headache out of nowhere, and it kept getting worse as the day went on. And that was also making me grumpy, so I decided to stay in the engine room so I didn't have to deal with any of the others or accidentally snapping at them." Clearly that hadn't gone to plan, though, and Gleeson could easily tell that Leo was feeling incredibly guilty about that. He didn't like Leo's lack of sleep last night either, but he knew that was out of the kid's hands more often than not, and he wouldn't be able to get that much more sleep most nights, even if he tried. Gleeson nodded for Leo to go on, so Annabeth came in randomly and wanted to talk. I kind of expected, or hoped really, that it'd be something short, but then she sat down and just kept talking. I tried my best to follow along, and I really tried to show her I was listening, but Leo had worked himself up by telling the story and was on the edge of starting to cry again. His breath hitching and his voice cracking. Gleeson quickly pulled him back into his hold with the arm still around Leo's back, hushing him and running through the breathing exercises once more. When he had calmed down again, the demigod sat back up with an embarrassed chuckle. Anyways, Leo continued, and the brief, relaxed mood dissolved back into seriousness. I really tried to focus and listen, but my headache was just getting worse and worse as Annabeth kept talking, and Leo paused to take a shaky breath, and Gleeson felt pride well up in him at the fact that the demigod was recognizing when he was starting to get upset again, and knew how to calm himself down before the satyr had to step in. I guess Annabeth noticed then that I wasn't feeling great, so she asked me if I was all right. I said I was fine because I really just wanted her to finish what she wanted to say and leave. I know I should have said something at the start when it was clear she was planning to stay for a while, but I liked talking to Annabeth, and I didn't want to be rude and turn her away when she said she'd gone out of her way to find a time to talk to me, so I just didn't. Gleason's heart ached at the pain in Leo's voice, and he gave the boy a comforting squeeze again. He'd known for ages that Leo would always put others' wants over his own needs, no matter how negatively it affected him, but it was painful to see it in action. At the same time, though, Gleeson was proud of the fact that it seemed like Leo had grown enough to at least recognize that wasn't the best idea for him or for others, even if Gleeson also knew that despite that it would still be a long while before Leo could actually change the behavior. Bad habits were hard to break at the best of times. So I tried to reassure Annabeth that I was fine, so she could say what she needed to and go, but I guess she didn't believe me or something because she just kept asking me over and over what was wrong, even when I kept trying to tell her I was fine and to stop asking. Leo kept going, and although he was making sure to keep as calm as he could, he started to speak faster, and some of his words started to blend together, but not badly enough that Gleeson couldn't understand him. And she kept getting louder and louder and more intense, and it was making my headache worse and worse, and then another deep, shaky breath in and out. and I just really wanted her to leave me alone because it hurt so much, and I was starting to panic, I think, and my brain was trying to figure out how to deal with everything going on, and it was also overwhelming, and I just really needed Annabeth to stop talking and go away, so that's what I said. The second Leo finished talking, he sighed into Gleeson's hold again like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Head tucked into the satyr's shoulder again, it had probably taken a lot out of him, but the son of Hephaestus had still managed to tell him the whole story, despite the shaken mental state he was in, and Gleeson was so proud of him for it, and voiced that to the kid too. "You did good, Valdez, telling me all that," he murmured in the kid's hair. "Thank you." He let out another shaky breath, just on the edge of a sob, and Gleeson just held him tighter. They stayed there in comfortable silence for a little while longer, despite the fact that Gleeson had intentionally tried to get the both of them into the most comfortable position he could when he first pulled Leo into his lap to comfort him. The hard floor and wall was starting to get a bit uncomfortable, but Gleeson also couldn't care less. He could not be moving until Leo wanted him to. As he let Leo start to doze again, Gleeson went back over to Leo's explanation in his mind. As he had thought, there had been something that ended up as the catalyst to Leo lashing out that Annabeth hadn't considered. He still couldn't fault her, though. He would probably just need to pull her and Percy off to the side later and explain in as little detail as he could that Leo had not meant to be rude and not try to go to Piper or Jason and tell them. However, it was then that he thought of something else. Leo had mentioned his headache multiple times throughout his story, and had cited his lack of sleep as the cause, but that didn't sound right to Gleeson. Sure, lack of sleep could definitely cause headaches, but never this bad, this soon into sleep deprivation. To confirm his suspicions, he had to look around the room, and sure enough, there were no cups or bottles. Leo's headache wasn't from lack of sleep, it was from dehydration. Gleeson would definitely need to get Leo some water in a second, but first he wanted to check something. He bounced his shoulder slightly, nudging Leo's head resting against it, getting his attention. "Valdez, I think your headache is from dehydration," he explained. "When was the last time you had something to drink?" Leo blinked up at him in confusion for a second, before his brow furrowed and he looked off to the side, thinking. Not really a good sign. Last night at dinner, I think," he finally answered, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Valdez, of course you have a headache if you haven't had anything to drink for so long," Gleeson sighed. "You need some water." Leo ducked his head in shame. "I'm not mad, kid, just worried," Gleeson admitted, and Leo looked up at him in shock, to which the satyr scoffed at him. "I'm the one having to look after you lot, and that includes having to deal with any of you running yourselves in the ground because you forgot to look after yourselves." "Huh?" Leo muttered. "Never thought of that before." "Of course you didn't," Gleeson dramatically huffed, dragging a tiny chuckle out of Leo. "How about this? You need to drink something, but I'll give you 2 options on how it can happen, and you can choose whichever you prefer. Sounds good?" "Yep." "Option 1, Gleeson said, holding up one finger with the hand not wrapped around Leo. "We both go down to the common area and get you a glass of water. If someone tries to bother you, I can turn them away if you want me to." Leo looked nervous, but nodded for him to go on. "Option 2, Gleeson continued, holding up a second finger. "I go get you a glass of water while you stay here. It means there's less of a chance for anyone to try and talk to you, but if they do, I won't be there to turn them away until I get back with the water." "Okay," Leo muttered. "So those are my options. You need to have something to drink. The options are just about how you'll end up getting it," Gleeson confirmed. They lapsed into silence once more as Leo thought. Gleeson was giving him time to decide. There were plenty of pros and cons for each option to think over, but he wouldn't wait too long before gently urging Leo to make a decision. The demigod needed water sooner rather than later. Finally, Leo looked back up, his decision made. Option 2, please," he managed to get out. Gleeson just nodded to reassure him. "That's fine, but I kind of need to get up first," he said teasingly. Leo flushed and quickly scrambled off the satyr's lap. "Sorry." Gleeson ruffled Leo's hair. "No need to apologize, kid. You're fine. I'll be back in a minute, okay?" "Okay." Gleeson stood up and made his way out of the engine room, waiting until the door was shut behind him to properly stretch and shake the discomfort out of his arms and legs. He didn't want the kid to feel bad for making Gleeson sit in an uncomfortable position. However unintentional it was, or how unnecessary the guilt would be. As soon as he was done, he quickly made his way back to the common area. It felt good to move around again and stretch his legs out, which also meant that he'd be able to spend more time sitting in a potentially uncomfortable position when he got back to Leo if it meant Leo would be happy. Annabeth and Percy were no longer in the common area, though Jason was now sitting at the table and snacking on an apple. Jason acknowledged his entrance with a nod, as his mouth was full of an apple, and Gleeson just did the same in return. He got the glass of water quickly and without fuss, and thanked whatever God was listening that Jason didn't care enough about what he was doing to ask, and that even if he did have a question, he was too polite to talk with his mouth full. On his way back to the engine room, Gleeson dodged quickly into the infirmary, grabbing out some painkillers to help with Leo's headache alongside the water. All in all, he was gone from the engine room for less than 5 minutes, and was relieved when he ducked back into the room to see Leo right where he left him, with no one else in the room. He took a seat next to Leo and handed over the water and painkillers, which Leo quickly took, popping the painkillers into his mouth before guzzling down the water. After he was finished, he looked over sheepishly. "I guess I really was thirsty," he chuckled, embarrassment tingling his voice. Gleeson just shook his head with a fond huff. "That'll tide you over for now, but you'll have to have more water later, got it?" Leo sat up straight and gave a mock salute. "Sir, yes, sir," he said seriously, before dropping the dramatics and flashing his iconic mischievous grin at Gleeson, who just chuckled and ruffled Leo's hair again. "I swear, what am I going to do with you?" he lamented half-heartedly. "Dealing with you is a full-time job on its own." Leo just laughed. "I don't know, Coach. Looks like you're going to have to deal with me for a bit longer." And even if he wouldn't say it, Gleeson didn't mind that one bit. And this was Chapter 2 of Again I Reach Out. Fuck, I forgot the second part. Damn it. So, yeah, that was Part 2. I hope you all enjoyed. And because it is winter break, I might be able to post more frequently. Hopefully I can. And if I do, the first one of the extra videos will be the second part of the Taboos of Percy Jackson, because I read the first part of that and just kind of forgot about it. So yeah, if I do another video before Sunday, that's what it'll be. And then Sunday will be Our Broken Repair Boy, Part 7, I believe. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed. Bye!